All right, so get this. We're diving into Pink Panther today.
Pink Panther?
Yeah, it's a new designer drug, and it's causing a lot of trouble, especially around the San Francisco Bay Area.
Interesting.
And what's really wild is that it's not just one drug. It's like a crazy mix of everything you can imagine.
Oh, really? Like what?
We're talking ketamine, MDMA, meth cocaine, even opioids, all in one.
Wow, that's a pretty intense combination.
Yeah, and the potential effects are all over the map.
I bet.
So to help us unpack this, we've got a couple of YouTube videos from medical professionals, Medical Secrets, and CPSI training.
Okay.
And another one from a chemist, Dr. Joe Schwartz.
Sounds like we've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do.
Well,
What do you think we're going to find?
Well, just the fact that it combines so many different drugs is a huge red flag right off the bat.
Yeah.
It's like they're trying to hit every receptor in the brain at once, which is incredibly risky.
Okay, so let's break down this chemical cocktail, as they call it.
Sure.
First up, ketamine. I know it's used medically, but what makes it so dangerous in this mix?
Well, ketamine is a really tricky one.
How so?
Medical Secrets really dives into this. On the one hand, it can be used for depression and anxiety, even addiction treatment.
Really?
Yeah, but it's also incredibly sensitive to your mindset and environment.
Oh, I see.
So if you're not in a controlled setting, the same drug that could be therapeutic could trigger paranoia, heart problems, even long-term bladder issues.
So the same drug that can help you break free from addiction could also become your new addiction.
Exactly. It's kind of a paradox.
That's wild.
It is. And it gets even more complicated when you consider the other ingredients.
Right.
Take MDMA, for example.
Okay. MDMA, also known as Molly or ecstasy.
Yeah.
I've heard it can be used to treat PTSD in veterans, but it's still a party drug with some pretty intense immediate effects.
Right. Things like teeth grinding, blurry vision, sweating, raising heart.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
But Medical Secrets also mentions the long-term risk of heart valve problems, especially with frequent use.
Oh, wow. So it's not exactly a harmless party drug then.
Not really.
Hold on. So this drug could potentially help people heal from trauma, but it could also damage their heart.
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the complexity of these substances. You know,
Yeah.
they can have both beneficial and harmful effects. And it often comes down to context and dosage.
That's a tough balance.
It is.
Ow.
Now let's move on to cocaine.
Cocaine, honestly, I always thought it was just a powder, but the fact that it comes from a plant is kind of surprising.
It does come from the coca plant, and some of its derivatives like lidocaine are actually still used in medicine today.
Wait, seriously, you're telling me cocaine is still used in medicine?
Believe it or not, it's used in certain ear, nose, and throat surgeries.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, because it can constrict blood vessels, but when cocaine is used recreationally, the effects are completely different.
I can imagine.
It acts on the whole body, leading to that dopamine rush and the potential for serious problems like addiction.
Okay, so maybe we should skip the cocaine lozenges after a tonsillectomy.
Definitely. And that brings us to methamphetamine, which is another stimulant in this mix.
Right.
Shares some similarities with cocaine, especially when it comes to that dopamine rush and addictive potential. But meth also carries a higher risk of serious physical damage, particularly to the teeth.
Yeah, the images of meth mouth are pretty disturbing. It's a stark reminder of the toll these drugs can take on your body.
For sure.
So we've got the stimulants, the psychedelic, and then they throw opioids into Pink Panther. Why on earth would they do that?
That's where it gets really interesting and potentially even more dangerous.
Okay, I'm listening.
The inclusion of opioids suggests that the creators are trying to exploit a particular vulnerability.
What do you mean?
Well, Medical Secrets talked about how people who experience trauma in childhood often don't develop the same natural endorphin pathways.
Oh, that makes sense.
So they're left with this kind of emptiness, and opioids, with their ability to mimic those feelings of comfort and security, can be incredibly alluring to those individuals.
So it's almost like they're trying to create a drug that appeals to people seeking both energy and escape.
Exactly. And that combination could be particularly dangerous for individuals struggling with past trauma or mental health issues.
Wow, so this Pink Panther isn't just a random mix of drugs. It seems carefully designed to hook a specific type of user.
It does seem that way.
This is starting to feel less like a party drug and more like a weaponized cocktail targeting people's vulnerabilities.
That's a good way to put it. It highlights the dark side of the designer drug phenomenon.
Yeah.
These creators aren't just throwing random chemicals together. They're using sophisticated knowledge of brain chemistry to create substances that are highly addictive and potentially even more harmful than traditional drugs.
Okay, so we've unpacked the individual ingredients of Pink Panther, and it's clear this is some seriously scary stuff.
Definitely.
But this brings up a bigger question. How are these designer drugs even created in the first place?
That's a question Dr. Schwartz addresses in his video.
And what does he say?
Essentially, chemists are tweaking the molecular structure of existing drugs, sometimes making just tiny changes to create new substances that can bypass existing laws.
So it's like they're playing a high-stakes game of chemical Jenga.
Kind of, yeah.
Pull out the wrong piece and the whole thing collapses. But in this case, it's people's lives that are at stake.
It's a dangerous game, for sure.
And CPSI training mentioned how difficult it is to even track these new drugs.
Absolutely.
It seems like they're constantly evolving, changing faster than we can understand them.
Exactly. And that unpredictability is what makes them so dangerous.
Right.
You never really know what you're getting with a designer drug. Even within the same brand, the ingredients and dosages can vary wildly.
So someone might think they're buying the same drug they had last week, but it could be completely different.
It's possible.
That's terrifying.
It is, and it makes it incredibly difficult for users to assess the risks, for law enforcement to identify the substances, and for medical professionals to treat overdoses.
It's like a nightmare scenario, and what's worse is that they're marketed in such a way that it makes them seem harmless. Plant food, bath salts, come on. It's clear they're intentionally trying to mislead people.
Absolutely, and the marketing often targets young people.
Oh, really?
Yeah, with colorful packaging and flavors that make these substances look like candy.
Yeah, I remember that example from CPSI training about a store selling a designer drug right next to the candy section.
Wow.
It's like they're deliberately trying to hook a new generation on these dangerous substances.
It's a blatant disregard for public health and a reminder that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry driven by profit, not concern for people's well-being.
So it's not just a matter of individual responsibility. There are powerful forces at play here that are actively pushing these drugs into our communities.
Exactly, and that's why we need to be having these conversations, shining a light on the dangers and demanding accountability from the people who are profiting from this crisis.
Well, this deep dive has certainly been eye-opening. We've gone from a single drug to a global industry in just a few minutes.
It's a lot to take in.
It is a lot to process.
It is, and we've only scratched the surface.
So where do we go from here?
Well, let's dive deeper into the larger landscape of designer drugs and explore what's being done to address this growing threat.
All right, let's do it. This conversation is just getting started. It's kind of crazy to think about just how widespread this is. I mean, I knew designer drugs were out there, but Pink Panther and how it specifically targets certain vulnerabilities, that's really unsettling.
It is, and it kind of highlights that this isn't just a local problem.
Right.
You know, that DW News video from Poland shows they're popping up all over the world.
Yeah.
And that roundtable discussion, it was pretty grim about the global synthetic drug trade.
Yeah, that roundtable discussion was really interesting. They talk about how these drugs are often made in these kind of makeshift labs, sometimes even people's kitchens.
Yeah, like a Breaking Bad situation.
Yeah. The barriers to entry are incredibly low, which is scary.
Exactly. And with the low production cost and high potency, the potential for this trend to explode is huge.
Yeah, Roundtable also mentioned that traditional law enforcement tactics, like cracking down on supply, haven't really been effective.
Right.
In fact, they might even be making things worse by driving the creation of even more dangerous drugs.
Yeah, it's a classic case of unintended consequences.
So it sounds like we need a totally different approach. What's the alternative to just trying to shut these labs down?
Well, the roundtable experts argued that we need to shift our focus from prohibition to harm reduction.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not totally clear on what it means.
Harm reduction, it focuses on minimizing the negative consequences of drug use rather than trying to just get rid of it completely.
Okay.
So things like needle exchanges, safe consumption sites, access to drug testing kits all fall under that umbrella.
I see. So it's about meeting people where they're at.
Exactly. Providing support without judgment and hopefully guiding them towards safer choices.
So I can see how those strategies could help reduce overdoses, the spread of diseases, things like that.
Yeah, for sure.
But aren't they kind of controversial?
Oh, definitely.
I mean, some people might argue that it's enabling drug use.
There's definitely stigma surrounding harm reduction, but the evidence shows that they actually save lives. And they can be a stepping stone towards recovery.
It's about recognizing that addiction is complex.
Yeah.
And we can't just arrest our way out of it.
Exactly. We need a multi-pronged approach that addresses the root causes, provides access to treatment, and supports people in making healthier decisions.
It sounds like a pretty massive undertaking, especially with these designer drugs constantly changing and evolving.
It is a big challenge.
How can we even stay ahead of the curve?
So education is key. The more we understand about these substances, how they affect the brain, the risks involved, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions and protect ourselves and our communities.
So we need to be proactive, not reactive. We can't just wait for another tragedy to happen before we start taking action.
I agree. We need to be having open and honest conversations about drug use, debunking myths, and sharing evidence-based information. And that includes talking to young people who are often the most vulnerable.
Right, and I imagine that's where resources like these videos we've been discussing come in.
Definitely.
They can help educate people in a way that's engaging and accessible.
For sure. And it's not just about individual education either. We need to be advocating for better policies, more funding for research and treatment, a more compassionate approach to drug use in general.
Speaking of research, one thing that really struck me in the CPSI training video was how difficult it is to even identify these new designer drugs.
Oh, yeah.
They said traditional drug tests are often ineffective because the chemical structures are changing all the time.
That's a huge challenge.
It means that even if someone ends up in the hospital after taking one of these drugs, doctors might not be able to figure out what's in their system.
Right.
Which makes treatment incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's a really tough situation.
And it makes it harder to collect data on the effects of these drugs.
Yeah.
And develop, effective prevention and treatment strategies.
Right.
It's like we're always playing catch up.
We are. And it highlights the need for more investment in forensic science drug testing technology.
Yeah.
We need to be able to identify these substances quickly and accurately if we want to have any chance of mitigating the harms.
This is starting to feel really overwhelming.
Yeah.
And where do we even begin to tackle a problem this big?
It is daunting, but it's not hopeless.
Okay.
I think the first step is recognizing that this is a shared responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a problem for law enforcement or healthcare providers or even educators. It's something we all need to be concerned about and engaged in addressing.
So what can we as individuals do to make a difference?
Well, there are a lot of things we can do. We can educate ourselves and our loved ones about the risks.
Okay.
We can support organizations working on harm reduction drug policy reform.
Right.
We can advocate for more funding for research and treatment. And we can challenge the stigma surrounding drug use by talking about it openly and compassionately.
Those are all great suggestions, but I have to admit I'm still feeling a bit pessimistic.
I understand. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, but it's important to remember that even small actions can have a ripple effect.
So we can't just give up and say it's too big to fix.
No, not at all.
We have to start somewhere, even if it's just conversations like this one.
Exactly. And those conversations can lead to greater awareness, understanding, and ultimately positive change.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about. I feel like I have a much better understanding of the dangers of designer drugs, but also how much work we have to do to address this.
It is a complex issue, and there are no easy answers.
So what's the next step in this journey?
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and explore some specific examples of designer drugs and their impact on communities around the world.
Okay, I'm ready to dive deeper. So we talked about Pink Panther and the challenges of designer drugs and, the need for harm reduction.
Yes.
I'm curious to hear some of these specific examples that you mentioned.
Okay, sure.
What other designer drugs are out there and what kind of impact are they having?
Well, one of the most concerning trends is the rise of synthetic opioids, like fentanyl.
Oh, yeah. Fentanyl.
They're incredibly potent, and they're being mixed with other substances, often without the user even knowing.
Yeah, the Vice News video we saw was pretty scary. They said fentanyl is like 100 times stronger than heroin.
Wow.
And carfentanil even worse, like 10,000 times stronger. It's mind-boggling how something that powerful can even exist.
It really is, and the fact that these substances are so available is a major concern.
Right.
The Vice News report highlighted how fentanyl is often made in these secret labs overseas and then smuggled into countries like the U.S., where it's fueling this huge surge in overdose deaths.
That's so sad. And I remember they also talked about benzodope, which is this mix of benzodiazepines and opioids.
Oh, yeah.
That just sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is. Benzodiazepines are usually prescribed for anxiety and sleep disorders, but when you combine them with opioids, the risk of respiratory depression and overdose goes way up.
It seems like every time we think we're getting a handle on one designer drug, another one pops up that's even more dangerous.
It does feel that way.
It's like a never-ending cycle.
It can feel like that. And it's a reminder that we can't be complacent. We need to be constantly learning, adapting, and coming up with new strategies to deal with this threat.
So what can we learn from the past? I mean, we've been dealing with drug problems for decades. Are there any lessons from previous epidemics that we can apply to what's happening now?
Absolutely. One of the biggest lessons is that focusing just on punishment doesn't work.
Mm.
The roundtable discussion, they highlighted how prohibition can backfire.
Right.
It drives the drug trade underground,
Hmm.
makes it harder to regulate and control.
So we need to move away from punishment and towards, prevention, education, harm reduction.
Exactly. And we also need to be willing to challenge our own biases and assumptions about drug use and addiction.
Yeah.
It's easy to think this is somebody else's problem,
Right.
that it only affects certain communities or types of people. But really, addiction can affect anyone.
You're right. It's a human problem, not a moral one.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to approach this with compassion and understanding. We need to create a society where people feel comfortable asking for help, where treatment is easy to get, and where recovery is possible.
Those are powerful words. This deep dive has been an intense journey. We started with the ingredients of Pink Panther and ended up talking about the global implications of the designer drug trade. What's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is that the world of drugs is changing really fast. And it's more important than ever to know the risks. We can't just ignore this and pretend it's not happening. We need to talk about it, openly challenge the status quo, and demand better solutions.
I totally agree. This has been a real eye-opener, and I hope it's given our listeners the information they need to take action. Knowledge is power, right? And the more we know about these dangers, the better we can protect ourselves and our communities.
Well said. This conversation is just the beginning, and I encourage everyone to keep learning, keep exploring, and keep asking questions.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.